Why is there a hobo on your screen? Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. It is Saturday, which means it is time for us to do the weekly progress update. Now, this time around, I decided that maybe my ugly mug is going to be slightly more entertaining than a blue background with a website address, so hopefully I can squeeze some value out of this whole homeless look. It does, however, drive me nuts that in order to get 60 FPS out of this piece of shit webcam, I have to drive what is equivalent to 2 red dwarfs worth of sunlight onto my face. Do not be fooled how dark this room is, it is actually broad daylight. Anyways, in the last few videos, I had a lot of content to go through for all of the previous projects because my hard drive has accumulated anywhere between several months up to a year worth of content that I have been working on these projects. I just haven't been making the update videos. By now, however, you guys have seen all the updates for most of the projects except for maybe Dreadtail, and I have to take it a little bit slow on that one because my upload bandwidth is a little limited on Vimeo. I can't talk about updates on videos that I haven't uploaded to the platform yet. But with that said, since we're basically up to speed with most of the projects, hopefully these updates are going to be shorter now because I've set up a little bit of a progress schedule for myself to work on. So Monday and Thursday I work on Angular project. Tuesday and Saturday, which is today, I work on the RTAG Rise project. And of course, Wednesday I work on Dreadtail, which is called the Rapture Chronicles in my schedule. So, provided if I get up nice and early and get to work right away, I should have about 6 to maybe 8 hours that I could pour into each game on each one of those days. The day doesn't always turn out to be that productive, but it is a benchmark that I try to hit. So, without further ado, why don't we take a look at the progress we've made this week? Since this was a new week and new progress was yet to be made on the project, I decided to take things slow and maybe cover something that's been on a to-do list probably since the beginning of the to-do list's own existence, and that would be the little collection particles for the tree chopping mechanism. When you chop down the trees, little particles get spawned every time the chop is executed. Now, this is performed on cue with the sound, so I had a single function that essentially waits for that little chopping animation, the little axe animation to hit. When that function gets called, you can hear the sound. That's how I got the sound to be synchronized with the animation. And then all I did was detect whether or not the player is currently standing next to a mineable object. And in case that mineable object happened to be a tree, I talk to that tree and tell that tree to run its own function, which would essentially create an instance of the leaf particle. Now, I can't have a particle be present inside of the tree at all times because, first of all, this means that every single tree in the entire world will have a particle system just sitting there consuming whatever performance it consumes when it's idling. And that's not really a good thing. So instead, I decided to make the particle as a separate scene, and I simply instruct the tree to create a new instance of the particle, wait until all the particles die out since it's a one-shot particle, and then queue itself free. And of course, while I was on the subject of particles, and something that was also on the to-do list, I wanted to add some little dust particles for the player walk animation. Now, this is something I've learned quite a long time ago. It's not just an aesthetics thing, it's also something that allows you to root your character in the world that they're running around in. Much like in a lot of 3D games, if you have a building that's sitting on top of some dirt or some ground, make sure to place some foliage or some grass, some pieces of debris around the place, the seam where the building enters the ground, where the two meshes meet. It'll help you solidify them together. Same thing happens when you place little dust particles emitted by the player as the player's running around the world. It makes it seem like the player has tangible connection with the world. It's more believable to see the player in the world when the player can affect that world, even with something as simple and trivial as dust. Now, this was when I hit a few snags with the Godot's particle system. There's a couple of features I really wish it had, or if they're already there, I certainly couldn't find them easily enough. But the first one being is that if I wanted to make animated particles, every single particle that is created seems to be sharing the same exact frame. So if you make an animation of the dust particle dissipating within the animation frames, let's say there's a total of 7 frames, and in frame number 0, the dust particle is at its largest, and in frame number 6, the dust particle is basically just a tiny little dot right before it disappears. Right now, the way Godot engine generates particles is that all the particles that I've generated show the same exact animation keyframe. And that's kind of unfortunate because for this game's aesthetic, a lot of things are going to be hand animated. I'm actually leaning to hand animating a lot of objects from various angles. And there's going to be a lot of particles that will need to be present, and it would suck if all of them are visibly displaying the same exact frame as the neighboring particle, even though that particle might have been created 2 seconds ago. Another thing that I'm not too fond of is having to create a whole entire scene or to instance a whole new particle system in order to get a single instance particle. For example, in GameMaker Studio, when you set up a particle system, you get a set of functions that allow you to generate a burst of particles rather than just toggling this whole system on or off. And this allows you to create these particles on demand without having to generate a new particle system every single time. For now, to get around this, I just create an instance of the particle system, but hopefully in the future we're going to get something that doesn't require us to create a whole new scene. Now, picking up from my last video, when I was designing this little volumetric lighting fake effect coming out of the window, I realized that I really went completely overboard with the way I decided to implement it. I ended up creating a whole new shader material, and I ended up offsetting the UV data there, when in reality I could have simply set up a very simple spatial node. So I went into the scene, and while I was there, I realized, you know what, let's go ahead and fix this. All I had to do is create a spatial material, give it the proper texture. This time around, I set the spatial material to have additive blending, which allows us to make it look more like a light. And because it's a spatial material with a lot of predefined, already pre-programmed features, all we really had to do is to talk to the spatial material's UV offset X value, talk to it in GDScript, and offset it by a very small value multiplied by delta. Now, for this video, I decided to leave the best for last, and by far the most interesting thing that I've actually managed to do today is enemy pathfinding and behavior. So what we have here is a little placeholder enemy that you might have already seen floating around doing nothing, having tested our combat on. What they're doing right now is, as soon as the player walks into the range of detection, there is a raycast pointing towards the player, detecting whether or not the player is seen. The player could be standing behind a hill or behind a tree, which means that the enemy would not be able to see him. But as soon as the player is spotted, the enemy starts plotting a path towards the player. And most importantly is that if the player happens to leave the initial path destination, the enemy is going to talk to the navigation node and is going to request to get a new path with the most up-to-date location. Now, I also wanted to do a little bit of an extra behavior. So what happens when the player gets spotted by the enemy? Well, the enemy starts going towards the player and constantly keeps a raycast pointed towards the player's direction. If, for any reason, the raycast gets obstructed, which means the player had put some sort of an obstacle between himself and the enemy will make a note of where the player was seen last. And when the enemy reaches that destination, he's going to go into the search mode. This is where the use of state machines had really helped me to make sense of the enemy behavior and keep this the many behaviors in a manageable state. Easy to work with, easy to switch between, and easy to add additional behaviors to should I want to do that. So if while being chased, the player manages to break the line of sight with the enemy is going to reach the last known player location, then generate a random coordinate around the last known player's location, and then go to that coordinate. Stand there for a little while, and then pick another point, and then stand there for a little while. The enemy is going to do this anywhere between 3 to 8 times just to keep up the suspense. And then if by that point the enemy never discovers the player, means the player never crosses the raycast, the enemy will consider the player to be lost and they will return to their initial spawn point. To be honest, it seems too easy when you can actually see the debugging flags. This is just a little script I set up, making the enemy place these glowing flags telling us where each and every path point is. And of course, once you see them, you know exactly where the enemy is going. But once you remove those, it actually is already quite fun to just try to evade, play hide and seek with these things. Of course, it's fun in games now, but you know, once you're playing this game and there's all sorts of horror sounds and all sorts of weird noises being played, yeah, it's gonna be kind of stressful. At least that's what I'm hoping to achieve, being the horror junkie that I am. Now, keeping in mind that this is not going to be the only enemy in the game that will have to be able to do pathfinding and searching for the player, returning to the spawn position, the entire code base for this behavior has been written in a separate script. And all I'm doing with this little tester enemy is I have them inherit that script, which means anything that's in that script they will do as well, and which means I can actually build on top of that script all the additional and unique behaviors that only exhibit in that particular enemy. Now, in this particular case, it's a very simple thing. The only unique part that this enemy does is that when you get close enough to them, their eyes start glowing. Otherwise, they're fairly invisible aside from maybe witnessing their silhouette far in the background in the fog. Also, at some point, I had accidentally moved all of the objects off in order to figure out something about the terrain, and holy crap, does that look creepy. It's just basically bodies floating in the midair. Good lord, I really like that aesthetic, and it actually made me think of the Death Stranding from the game called Death Stranding. It turned out to be a really creepy sight, and I think it's just perfect for this game. So, this is all that we have for this week for Child of Ether. Why don't we move on to the next project? It has been a very long time since I've actually made any tangible progress on the RTAG Rise from the engine side. All these months, all I've been doing is working and reworking the script for the trial course section, which is essentially supposed to be the demo of the game. Now, the trial course section is effectively a small part of one of the quests that is going to be a part of the larger project. Now, script writing is... it is a long process. Maybe it's because I'm going about it for the first time in such a serious manner, but I would write a script and I would be almost sure that this is what I want to go for. This seems to hold up. The characters seem to be believable. They talk like what real people would talk in a situation. There's a little bit of exaggeration. The dialogue seems real. The situation seems real. The resolution seems real. There's a lesson. There's a moral. There's a theme. Everything seems to be fitting just fine. And then I would put the script away and I would come back to it a month later, and it seems like there's just giant pits of complete garbage among some stuff that is reasonably still usable. Now, I'm being mentored by my father in the process of script writing and storytelling, and he says this is a completely normal process. And I can kind of put two and two together as a game developer, because there are going to be plenty of times when a whole bunch of artwork and some mechanics are going to be thrown out. It's something that I've done before. As a matter of fact, it's something that happened to me when I started working on the visual part of the project again. But I never imagined that the scope of the chunks I would have to toss out would be this big. There's plot holes, there's issues with the storytelling that require me to basically throw away giant portions of certain scenes that I've written, because the post-analysis with my father on what these scenes supposed to represent makes me see that they are about nothing. They don't bring any sort of value forth in the narrative, with the most egregious culprit being any dialogue that just doesn't move the action forward. Filler dialogue. I'm a huge fan of science fiction and horror, and boy, did I insert a lot of very unnecessary jargon everywhere. It wasn't until the last iteration that I started noticing that the volume of rewrites that I've been undergoing has significantly decreased. As a matter of fact, for the most part, the dialogues are the only thing that I'm starting to adjust now, which means it is finally a fairly safe place for me to start recording placeholder dialogues, if not, maybe even attempt to see if those dialogues can be used in the final project, and start building the levels around the scene that have now been, hopefully, solidified. And unfortunately, having brought the script to its current state, I realized that the level that I have been putting together and outfitting with all the backgrounds and tiles and backdrops, setting up the tile layout and figuring out where the players are going to go, has pretty much been nullified. At this point, that scene is effectively just a sandbox. It was a sandbox where I had developed the dialogue system that doesn't require you walking up to a character and talking to that character, but from the gameplay perspective and from the narrative perspective, that scene is pretty much useless now. I will most likely see if I can retrofit it to some sort of an intermediate area, maybe an in-between level where the narrative doesn't really progress that much, but for the level that will be following the script as of now, I will definitely have to make a new one, keeping in mind of what it is that the characters are doing in the script. This, to be honest, brings me to the point where I think maybe I go way too much into prettifying my levels way too early on, because this is honestly a pretty large chunk of work that just kind of got tossed out. I've been recently introduced to the concept of agile development, which is a process where you try to set up your entire game, entire project, entire piece of software in its most bare bone but functional level. There's no presentation, there's no pretty effects, there's no post-processing. It's just the functionality in its most basic bare bone functional form. And then after the entire process has been completed on that level, using some very simple shapes, very simple tiles, not overcomplicating anything with polish, then we go back to the beginning of the project and start replacing placeholder assets with maybe some custom stuff. Start putting in the actual assets into the game, designing them, texturing them, placing them where they need to go, and then you go through the entire project doing that as well. Finally, there's a third pass where you go through the entire game with a fine-tooth comb, polishing everything, getting all the nooks and crannies, and straightening all the nuisances, and essentially getting the final polish on the game. Up until this point, I've been working in a workflow known as waterfall workflow, which is where you come across an asset that you realize you need and you make the full design, get it fully textured, fully modeled, fully animated, do whatever you need to do to get it up and running, and then shove it into the project. And then you move on to the next portion. You say, oh, now I need this asset or this functionality or this character or this feature. And then, well, you go through the entire process again, doing the full design, getting the full aesthetic, getting the full set of animations. And, well, if something happens and for some reason that asset is no longer required or it no longer fits the nature of the project, then that's a lot of progress that's just been tossed out. And of course, a lot of developers at that point will start thinking, well, I designed it, so I gotta use it. And that's, of course, the sunk cost fallacy, which, you know, it's easy to tell somebody else not to do it, but when it's your content on the line, it just becomes a whole different issue. And that's exactly what I had experienced with this particular level here. I've been working hard on putting together the tiles and then hiring a pixel artist to redo those tiles. And while he was doing that, I wanted to set up some bushes, some assets, some environmental stuff, some telephone poles, some wires hanging off of those, all sorts of devices and gadgets hanging around. I got the parallax background in place. I got multiple tile layers on top of the dirt. And in the end, while I was revising the script to get it to a more or less stable state, I had to completely rewrite the initial introduction of the story, which means this entire level just became useless for that introduction, and the part where this level was supposed to come in had been tossed out entirely. And the most important thing is that this level had been designed with the narrative in mind, with the length of the dialogues in question. The amount of ground the players had to cover was specifically set up in such a way where by the time the characters finished talking what they were talking about, they reached their destination. So of course now that is no longer the case, and most likely I'll just have to see if I can retrofit it into some other passive part that doesn't have any narrative happening in it. Now, this is kind of a difficult thing for me to do because I've been working in this waterfall mode for years and years for all of my projects, for all my prototypes, but it may also perhaps be the reason why I've never actually finished a full game. Maybe working in this waterfall mode had simply sucked out all the energy before I could get to some sort of a milestone. So what I'm going to try to do now is I'll see about finishing up and wrapping up anything I've already started, and then now that I have my script in place that is still going through some revisions, but at least I'm fairly confident we can record some voice lines and they will be fairly sure to be in the final script. I can work on just the functionality, just the features, just getting the dialogues to work, just getting the basic functionality and the base gameplay in place. And we'll see about going through the entire demo gameplay in this mode, and only after we're done coming back and reworking everything and adding all the polish. The next thing I want to talk about here is the dialogue system that I had been setting up for this project. Seems like a fairly detached component. What we have at the bottom is actually a dialogue system that I've created long before I've made the dialogue builder, which is now part of my the Concept Bay website. The dialogue that you see here is actually just completely been set up as a dictionary inside of Godot engine, and all of the functionality lets us to go through this dialogue while we're still playing the game without actually engaging or physically contacting another character. Now, this type of dialogue, I think, would be perfect for these sort of passive conversations to fill in the gaps of players traversing the environment without really undergoing any particular challenges. But at the same time, I also have to consider that if that tool stays as its own dedicated thing, the process of creating the dialogues there is actually going to be pretty lengthy. Between my last update and this one, I had created the dialogue builder user interface all inside of WebDev environment, and it basically creates all the dialogue data for a particular character and outputs it as a JSON file. I have also integrated that dialogue builder into, or I should say the output file for that dialogue builder is now completely integrated and recognized by other games like Child of Ether and Angler. And what I really have to figure out is how to make that dialogue builder also work with this system, this passive conversation system that gets triggered and allows characters to go through some sort of a discussion, some sort of a back and forth while they're going through the level without really walking up to each other and pressing the interact button like you would with any other NPC. Essentially, scripted discussions, scripted events, scripted conversations. Now, sadly, this might also mean that I will have to scrap that system. So maybe I decided to take on that passive dialogue feature a little bit too early. Maybe I should have waited until I had this other dialogue builder set up and only then gone through the process of setting up all these pop-up boxes and getting the dialogue timing up and running. But it is what it is. Maybe we can learn something from the both of them and make a cumulatively stronger dialogue system by combining features from the both of them together. Now, my thoughts on switching to a more streamlined process for developing these projects has only really come to me right about now, actually, as I'm recording this. I'm looking at myself pouring all this time into all these assets, and it's not really moving the project forward. The game itself isn't really moving forward. I can make all the tiles and all the sprites until the chickens come home, and the project will not be in any more of a sellable final playable state than it was, let's say, like half a year ago. Since it's been a while since I've actually even opened the project itself, I took a look at the assets that have been made for it up until this point, and to be honest, I wasn't really impressed. I had hired a sprite artist, a game artist on Fiverr to create some of these tiles, and initially they seemed alright, but now that I look at them, I just think, nah, it could be better. It could be way better. And the problem is, by this point, I've already, of course, spent the money on all the commissions. There are still certain tiles and certain assets, I should say, that I can still find a use for, but for the sort of money that I can spend on an artist, I am not gonna get a great result. And this kind of shows in some of the background assets. I noticed that the trees have a lot of copy-pasted shapes, which is corner cutting. It's basically just corner cutting. I don't know if it's corner cutting in order to make these particular tiles or sprites fit within the budget that we have agreed on, but for whatever, like $150 for the set of trees, I think maybe each tree should have been drawn uniquely rather than copied pasted with the shapes. So I would have to drastically increase the amount of money I'm spending on commissioned assets, or I'm gonna have to do them myself, and I'm heavily leaning on doing those myself. As an indie developer with the sort of budget an indie developer can work with, commissioning artists and expecting to get a usable result is just not a reality for me. So this kind of led me onto the path of figuring out how can I create these tiles a little bit more efficiently. And that led me to remember that there was a particular piece of software that was developed for easy tile generation called TileSetter. This program had actually impressed me because it had cut down my tile generation process maybe almost to a tenth of its initial time commitment. A lot of my time when creating tiles would go into recreating or realigning these repetitive tile versions that should really be automated, and that is indeed what the TileSetter software does for you. There are, of course, some fallbacks in the tile generation. There's still certain operations that could have definitely been automated further, but that actually got me thinking that if we have TileSetter that almost works kind of like a preset that chops up your graphics and puts them into some sort of a preset definition, why can't we perhaps try to create some sort of a preset CRIDA document, for example? All you do is just click on the file, swap out the source file. There are clone layers that clone the original file, so if the original changes, the clone layer changes, and it just propagates that throughout all the locations on the tile. It already has all the alpha masks applied, it has all the textures and transitions in place. All we have to do is swap out the base tile, the ground, the top, and the corners, and that's it. It just generates the tile for me. I am actually considering on experimenting on a template like this for easy tile generation, and perhaps it's going to make it even easier than TileSetter does for me right now. Now, having finished this tile, having finished this experiment, and having figured out how TileSetter actually works, looking at the final result, I am convinced that I can produce better tiles than the artists that I had commissioned initially. Which, you know what? All the artists in the comment section can be crying, telling me I'm wrong, telling me I have to commission artists because that's the best for the economy, best for the artists, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I know. Listen, if I'm going to be commissioning an artist, I'm probably just going to be hiring, right? Not commissioning, hiring. Somebody who is on staff, somebody who actually arrives to the studio. I will be more than happy to set up a room specifically for the studio work, and if I can get the funding that actually makes that happen, it's gonna be way better for the both of us. Because for me, I will work with somebody with whom I can just immediately correct on any sort of artistic direction to fit the project right away, instead of having to finish a portion or the entire tile set and then realize that it just doesn't work. And of course, for the artist, it will mean that they will get paid something they can actually survive on. I mean, the tiles I've commissioned with the other sprite artists were maybe 100, 150 bucks, 200 bucks. There is no way that is even remotely survivable, so no wonder they were cutting corners. So for the immediate time, I will just have to rely on my own skills, on my own abilities, and get my projects to the point where I can make enough money to hire somebody who will do a better job than I can do 100% of the way. My final bit of progress for this week was to figure out what was happening with the character designs, because they looked really weird, almost disproportionate. Now, a part of the problem was the fact that the heads and the bodies of the characters were created as two separate sprites, because the body is basically like 8 frames in total. There's the run cycle, the jump cycle, which is just a single frame, sliding down frame, and idle frame. That's basically it. There's no other frames, so it doesn't really make sense to have to redraw all those frames for each and every single character. So what I had done is I'd created a single body. I had filled it with white color, which means that in Godot, using the modulate property, we can color it whatever color we want based on the character preference, and then the heads are just kind of pasted in on top in an offset according to the animation frames. I'll be honest, I was actually ready to completely redesign the characters and reanimate their entire bodies, all their cycles, their heads. As a matter of fact, I was even considering doing the Super Meat Boy way, which is effectively just designing the head and body as one single rectangular thing. I was really tempted to go that route because it made sense. The entire level is very blocky, right? The tiles are rectangular, so the rectangular characters would kind of fit the rest of the aesthetic. But then I simply attempted to redraw the heads, and it must have been maybe even years since I've drawn those original faces, those heads for the Tim and Milo characters. The new version just came out way better, and you have to understand that since I drew those faces, I've been practicing drawing a lot for our Retroactive Gamers content. I've drawn more characters, more designs. I've been doing animation, like little fan animations, taking our little voiceovers and animating some gags over those. I've been busy working on those, and I think the practice that I got from the Retroactive Gamers related animation stuff had helped me to design a new set of heads for this game, and that's all that I really had to do. I think a part of the issue was that the original heads were also designed in way too large of a resolution. Our camera is actually quite far away, so there's no way the Godot engine is capable of drawing each and every single pixel of those faces, especially since after looking at the sprite node, I realized that I was also scaling the head sprite down by, I think, 0.7 scale value, which basically means that Godot was squeezing additional pixels into the same amount of space on the screen, which is impossible, which basically means that Godot engine had to drop a bunch of pixels to somehow draw the faces in the limited amount of space it was given. And that kind of made the character faces to look concerned or motionless or emotionless. It was a very weird expression, and it just didn't work. Now, something that really helped to eliminate that and give the characters a more neutral and more universal expression on their face that allows you to project whatever emotion you might be hearing in the voiceover was to exclude the mouth on the character's face. It was such a weird thing, but as soon as I decided to remove the mouth on the character's face, I got more space for the nose and eyes, and that made the characters look a bit more neutral, but it's the sort of neutral that allows you to project whatever emotion you want onto their face by itself. No extra work required, no extra facial animations required. Of course, having done that, I was really happy that I didn't have to redo the entire animation for the bodies, although I might want to revisit kind of redrawing it a little bit, maybe retracing it just a bunch to get it to look a bit more applicable. I decided to start blocking out the first level that the players are going to be able to play when the narrative begins, when the demo level starts. There's supposed to be a very small section when the characters escape a testing chamber that is just engulfed in flames. It's about to explode. They need to somehow find their way out of there, and that is supposed to lead into the exposition flashback as soon as they do, which of course allows me to lay down some narrative basics and foundation, which the viewers need to know about in order to make sense of the story. And this time I was set not to make the same mistake and not to put the complete final polish onto the level right from the get-go. I just want to work on the functionality alone, just get that whole thing out of the way, and then we'll come back and do all the polishing. It is going to be a very weird thing to do. I've never really taken the game development approach in this way, and I'm going to be struggling to restrain myself from, let me just design that one sprite. It's like, I have this idea. I could just write it down, but no, let me just like quickly animate. It's only gonna take an hour. It's not that big a deal, but it accumulates. It accumulates so much. So I'm gonna have to try to practically reprogram my workflow to try to work in that particular methodology. In any case, that's all that we have for RTAG Rise for today, so why don't we move on to the next project. It has taken a while, but we have finally finished setting up the Exposition Flashbacks. I did not actually expect how much work this was gonna take. And it's a good idea we had that talk about trying to reformat the way we go about developing these projects. This would have probably taken at least another month or even 2, considering all the models that have to be created for these scenes. It was around the development of this flashback sequence when I had the talk with the gentleman who's helping me out with setting up the models and a lot of the other project concepts for this particular game about the fact that we're kind of getting stuck inside of this loop of just constantly thinking about details for something that isn't even the entire game, and that's where the whole discussion of agile versus waterfall development process really came to be. Even with me deciding to go for the all-white, very light textures, black and white aesthetic, specifically so that we would not have to do as much texturing for all the models, it still took us almost 2 months to set this up. And most of that was pretty much just modeling, not even texturing. Most of the stuff here is still just white. So this kind of gives me a very clear indicator of what is going to happen if I just continue going about the development in a cross that bridge when we get to it sort of approach. So as a result, there's really not a whole lot that I can show off here. I mean, most of the stuff has pretty much been just programming the same sort of sequence just for a different area within this setup house. We fade out, we launch the dialogue, we let the player go through the dialogue until the end, we then fade in, we reposition the player object, we reposition the camera object, we enable and disable visibility for certain props and lights, we launch the animation, and then we fade back in, rinse and repeat. When I put it this way, it doesn't really sound like there's a lot happening, but in reality, this particular cutscene, because all the actions happening here are unique to their own flashback, I had to reprogram each and every piece from scratch, and I had to figure out how am I going to transition lighting between these scenes. There's daytime in one, there's nighttime in the other, there's pitch black in the last one. So it's a whole bunch of just little things like that, toggling on this, toggling off that, adjusting a whole bunch of properties across a whole bunch of different nodes in order to finally put this whole flashback together. That was really the bulk of all the work. Now, I wouldn't say that all of the time I spent working on this was a waste, because I really had to go through the process to get a feel for how long this whole thing is going to take. And now that I've finished this whole sequence from start to finish, meaning that at the end it pops us into the level where the gameplay is supposed to begin, I now have a general ballpark feeling of how long a flashback sequence like this is going to cost us in labor and time. And I would say just for that alone, it was worth it to go through the motions and set this up, because now I know, and now I can make future predictions. And now that I've integrated the whole flashback from start to finish, I am gonna set this aside. I'm not even gonna worry about other models or textures or really anything. This system works. From start to finish, it gets us into the flashback and it brings us back into the gameplay, so I can try to move on with the new method of game development from here on out. So now I find myself back a fish out of the water with this new methodology, trying to limit myself to not go too far into asset creation or focusing on details. I have to figure out how this whole thing works, how I'm going to go about developing this game. So the logical step for me would be to first establish the gameplay loop definition, which is effectively, for a narrative game, the definition of the goal that the player is going to be aware of, the main protagonist is going to be attempting to reach, the obstacles that are going to be placed in the way of reaching that goal, and of course the solutions to those obstacles. Now, this is really long and really boring to look at process. It's basically just me sitting in front of an empty Trello page with a list in front of me and trying to figure out what interesting obstacles can I place in the player's way, and what creative solutions can we use in order to overcome those obstacles. Oftentimes, this might even result in a brand new game mechanic that has to be programmed, so it's important to define these things early on. Not only that, I have to make sure that obstacles correlate with the narrative of the story, because it is, just like many of my other projects, a narrative game, and it doesn't make sense when an obstacle is just interjected without making any sense of how it relates to the whole story. You can really sense this sort of bullshit when a game just pulls out a random obstacle or action that the player has to complete that doesn't seem to resonate with what the rest of the game is. It's the classic case of having to design story into pre-existing mechanics, or having to somehow fit the mechanics you've come up with first into a story that was written way before. So that's basically all it is, and it's not a process that's very interesting to look at, so I didn't bother recording it. What you're gonna see instead is a completed list and us going through that list and actually modeling, leveling out the environment, block meshing the world geometry, basically going through the defined list and doing some work that might actually be more interesting to look at. Having defined the initial set of obstacles, I figured it might be a good idea to rethink the temple area, because right now it has been set up in a kind of a lackluster way with monuments and fountains and benches and doors without any rhyme or reason. This time around, by following the gameplay loop definitions with the obstacles and resolutions, I can actually design an environment that makes overcoming those obstacles fun. For example, we can have the player be told, you need to bring this particular crystal. Okay, so that crystal could be on the table in the other room. Cool, okay, well that's kind of boring. Or we could have this whole platforming section where there's a bunch of suspended rooms that the player has to jetpack from and to in order to get to the one room that has the crystal that we need. So that is basically what I started doing. I have scrapped everything that I've done in the temple room, and I decided to maybe take a bit of a different approach, block out some very basic geometry, not even worrying about textures, just using this standard grid texture I've used across several other projects. I've taken out a lot of objects that were previously baked into the world geometry and separated them to individual meshes, which allows me to mess around with them, play around with their positions, and use them as placeholder props. The temple area ended up being turned into something completely unrecognizable, and frankly, well, I don't know how I feel about it. It's very large and it's very grandiose. It feels a little bit too spacious for the very first thing that you see, or maybe not. Maybe we're just missing some very pretty carvings and very large statues and some impressive stuff that will be interesting to look at for the first time you enter an unknown alien vessel. I think I'm gonna spend a little bit of time in this area just trying to block out multiple ideas, several suggestions, several concept art pieces, just so that I have options. I don't want to settle on this because this looks very spacious and very grandiose, but I don't know if it really fits what the narrative needs to deliver in the very first few minutes of gameplay. I have to consider what kind of feeling am I trying to deliver and invoke and set up in these first few minutes, and what kind of geometry and level challenges are gonna allow me to do that. I can definitely say that this is unlike anything I've done before. I would most often pretty much settle on the first thing I would come up with, and honestly, so far it's worked, but how many great things did I miss out on if I had given it, let's say, another thought, or if I'd stepped away from a particular level or concept or gameplay loop and come back to it after maybe a week or a month and see what other fresh ideas are there, or at least see if my old ideas still stick, if they hold up. So far, I do appreciate taking a little bit longer to play around with these ideas, because it is slower, but it's also in a way feels like the progress is a lot faster, or we're covering more ground in the same amount of time at least. So this is all that we've done for this week. There's been some major refactoring and reconsideration of how we're going to go about the project, but slowly but surely we're trailing towards something that will be better than anything I've ever made before. So this is going to be it for the Angular progress. It's not much, what it'll do for now. How about we take a look at what is happening with the next project? The first thing on the list for the Dreadtail project was to set up the most basic mechanic that is supposed to be prevalent throughout the entire game. It is the one thing that you're supposed to be constantly doing in the game that is going to ensure your survival, working with batteries. Batteries are a vital ingredient in creating some of the defense mechanisms, as well as powering up segments of various found locations in order to ensure your survival. So the one thing I thought that might be useful in the game is being able to tell if a battery is full or if it is empty. Now, I could go about it in a very simple way and just make it so that when the player looks at the battery, it tells you how much charge there is in that battery, but at the same time, it's a mini game and there's already not a whole lot to do besides just run around, find locations, and craft your defense systems. So I thought it might be a good idea to gamify the process of figuring out if a battery has any power in it. So the idea was to create this little dial that you can craft into a battery optionally. You can find them all over the place. You can put them into a crafting bench, and essentially what you're going to get is a battery with an indicator attached to it. Otherwise, the only other way to tell if a battery is full or if it's empty or what level it's at is to take it out and plug it into a charging station, which also will have one of these charger indicators on it. So this little guy is essentially going to be a fairly universal, fairly modular component. It is going to be found on things like batteries you've crafted, the fuse boxes in various locations you find all over the forest. Those fuse boxes is where you're supposed to insert the batteries, so it might be a good idea for them to indicate how much power you have before the whole location goes dark. You're going to be finding these on park light poles. You can plug in batteries to those in order to envelop yourself in light when something is attacking you. There's a number of locations that the player can choose to make their stronghold. So to make management of the strongholds a lot easier, these battery indicators are going to be present on pretty much any piece of hardware that you can attach a battery to. This indicator is also going to be present on a battery charger unit, which is the next piece of hardware that I decided to program. This game revolves around a set of very basic mechanics, so I tried to gamify a lot of the very rudimentary things you'd be doing in this game, like for example charging batteries. This little crank charger that you see in front of you, the way the player operates them is they have to place a battery on one end and then pop into the other end, or at least look over to the other end, and start using their scroll wheel to ramp up the speed of the crank. I'm trying to make it feel like it takes a lot of work to spin this crank, as it usually would be with these types of dynamo machines. There's supposed to be a set of reduction gears that convert your torque into some pretty incredible speeds that end up spinning the shaft of the electric motor, and that of course in turn produces electricity, which you then use to charge your battery. In this case, it's a very dumbified concept of that, but it is essentially the same. And I wanted to make it feel like the crank is really tough to move. So what happens here is that the more the battery charges up, the tougher it is to move the crank. However, this could be used at an advantage because the player doesn't necessarily have to plug in a battery to spin the crank. If they're crafty enough, they can pre-spin the crank up to really incredible speeds because there is no resistance, because there is no battery loading the circuitry. So the player can simply pre-spin the crank to a very large speed and then plug the battery in, fast charging it along the way. Technically, both of these processes still take the amount of time, but the second method at least seems like it actually produces a slightly faster result. So there's more than one way you can really interact with these components. You can also see that the indicator doesn't light up until you actually plug in the battery, thus completing the circuit. I thought that was a neat little techie detail. So as you can see, the indicator is rising up. It is of course indicating how much the battery has been charged, and I am actually contemplating on giving the player the ability to overcharge their batteries at risk of them exploding, but providing a little bit of extra juice, and it would essentially work like extra health in Doom and Serious Sam games, where any extra health over 100 or 200 or whatever, you do get to have it for a little while, but it slowly decreases back to its maximum. So after spinning up the crank and plugging in the battery will start getting charged, and of course the crank will slowly reduce its rotational speed, and that is actually going to be stronger and stronger as the battery charges up. It might be even a detail that nobody will notice, but it's something that I had a lot of fun programming in. And of course this charging station can be used to charge large and small batteries alike. With that finished, the next thing on my list was to create the ladder climbing mechanic. There is going to be a number of very tall structures that the player will have to climb in order to evade hostile entities and paranormal scripted events, so we took some time to take care of that. One of the objects that I could already climb was the overland pipe structure, which is essentially a whole bunch of scaffolding with really large pipes going over the metal beams, and this was supposed to have been one of the safe places that the player can climb into and take a short breather. In the process of putting this together, I realized that I really have to sort out the collision shape of that overhead pipe structure, because there is a lot of detail and a lot of triangles and a lot of holes that shouldn't all count as something that the player can fall through. So what I had to do is pop back into the Blender project and separate the geometries for the pipes and the structure itself. You see, a lot of the pieces here could be combined as a very simple tri-mesh object generated right from within Godot engine, but these cross beams definitely were not it. Had I generated the tri-mesh collision object from within Godot engine for this entire structure, the resulting collision shape would have been in thousands of vertices, which is absolutely stupid on performance. What I ended up doing is separating the really detailed portions that could very easily be abbreviated in regular rectangles, and of course the pipes themselves, which actually do have to be slightly more detailed, and simply recreated the collision data within a single scene by combining both meshes and creating a tri-mesh static body for one, and simply relying on the collision cubes for the other. The climbing mechanic ended up working exactly as I expected it to. It's a very simple system. I decided to opt in for using a raycast, a very short one. I actually had to set up a second one specifically for ladder climbing. What happens is that when the player walks up to the ladder, there's an area node that defines the shape of the ladder. And the raycast, as long as it's touching that area node, that ladder area node, the player is considered to be on a ladder, which means the forward and backward button keys will in turn be controlling upwards and downwards movement. Now, of course, as soon as the player looks away from the ladder, the player will fall down under gravity, and I think this might help with the fast-paced nature of this project. You're supposed to be able to really get down quickly, maybe not this way, that's how you usually break your knees, but you get the idea. If you're playing with your buddies, your friends are probably not going to be too keen on waiting for you to get down the ladder, so you can get down to a relatively safe space and drop down and not break your legs in half. Next, I wanted to pick up from where we left off in the last video and get the fuse box that's supposed to be found across many of the found structures up and running. And of course, for now, it simply meant being able to open and close the lid of the fuse box. You see, the fuse box is kind of an interesting object because you're supposed to be able to interact with it and also with whatever's inside of it. So somehow we needed to make sure that the player cannot interact with the contents of the fuse box, which would be the batteries, while the lid is closed. Thankfully, Godot Engine offers all the nodes we need to build this feature, so all we had to do is set up the collision data for the lid, collision shape for the body, and we had to set up some alignment axes so that the lid can open up in the proper way. We had used the animation player node to set up the animation itself, and that's pretty much it. We already have the raycast inside of the player, which we use to pick objects up and interact with the charger, so that is exactly the same raycast, which is going to allow us to interact with the fuse box lid. The code for the fuse box interaction had to be corrected for the player spam button presses because they can really glitch out the animation and have the lid glitch into open state when we try to close it, and if the player immediately presses a button to close it now, it will just glitch into the open state again. The solution to this was simply to have a variable that keeps track of whether or not the lid of the fuse box is open or closed, and simply wait for the animation to finish playing, and then right after check if the state happens to match with the current animation that the animation player is set to. If the state of the lid is closed and the last animation the player was playing was open, it's going to say, okay, well, we got to play the close animation now. So this means if the player was dicking around with the lid for whatever, a few minutes, I'm sure there's going to be a sound that the player will hear. Whatever the last state that they left the lid on, that's going to be the animation the fuse box will end up playing. So the next step would be to be able to deposit batteries into these fuse boxes, but that means we have to be able to transport them as well. So before we handle the rest of the fuse box, I decided to handle the player's ability to interact with their inventory, to pick an item up with their mouse and place it into a different slot, to swap items if you happen to be carrying an object and then you're clicking on an inventory that also has an item in it, the two of them will swap places, and of course finally dropping something from the inventory on the ground. Now, for this particular project, I decided to go with non-stackable inventory, which means you are given a pretty ample amount of inventory slots, but one single item takes up one single slot. So this seemed to be kind of fair enough for me. The player won't have an egregious amount of space in their inventory to carry everything in the level, so they will still have to walk around, scavenge additional parts, and haul them back to whichever location they decided to make into their stronghold. So because we're foregoing the ability to stack items, this makes the inventory system a whole lot easier to work with. And because I use dictionaries for my inventory system, all you have to do is just check for presence of a particular key. That's all that is really required. I've done this inventory system to death across many projects, so this was a pretty trivial part to set up. Now, I have been asked, why is it that there's a loading circle around the object that you're trying to grab? Well, you see, I'm actually using the E key both for interaction and for grabbing. I think the E key is a very convenient key for both actions, and the delay between the pickup allows me to slow down the player when they are scavenging a particular area, if they're pack ratting everything. I didn't want the player to just walk into an area and just spam the E button on everything they see and just loot everything. I wanted to slow the process down. While the player is waiting to pick up an item and for that little bar to fill up, I can play some spooky sounds, some little jump scary stuff in the distance. The waiting part is what makes the player anxious, so I wanted to emphasize on that. Especially since this game is going to lean a little bit more into audio. While the player's busy waiting for the item to be picked up, they can't help but listen. Now that we can carry the batteries in our inventory, I can finally return to the fuse box and program the ability to deposit those batteries. Now, I want this game to be a little bit flexible with which batteries the players can use to power which objects, so that's why the fuse box is programmed to be very flexible. You see, you could pop in either 2 large batteries, or you could do 1 large battery and then 4 small batteries, or you could pop in all small batteries in the fuse box and power it from that entirely. As a matter of fact, usually the size of the battery not only determines its capacity but also determines its voltage. In this particular game, I'm actually thinking of completely foregoing the concept of voltages and just simply say the size of the battery determines its capacity. So you could power your survival location from one small 12-volt battery. It's just not going to last very long. And of course, because this game really doesn't have a lot going for it, I figured I'll let the player be flexible with what kind of batteries they choose to power their survival location stronghold with. I've defined a dictionary inside of the fuse box that essentially contains slots for 1 large battery and 4 small batteries for each shelf. And all I have to do is detect when a battery object enters the area and then scan the dictionary for any already present batteries. If you're trying to plug in a big one, you got to make sure there isn't already another big one and there are no small ones, because there's no space for a thick and a thin battery on one single shelf. Of course, if you're doing the same thing for the small batteries, all you have to do is make sure there isn't a big one and there's at least one available slot for the small batteries. For the most part, these survival locations will be located with light sources, which are going to be used to detract the hostile paranormal entities trying to kill you in this forest, but certain other locations will have additional features, like computer terminals that you can read the logs of whoever used the terminal before, some defensive mechanisms that have to be powered, and of course, the secondary objective will require the player to re-establish connections between many loose science fiction doohickeys, which all come together to blah 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 redacted. So the fuse box is finished and it's nice and flexible, and of course so far as I've tested, it is bug proof. It doesn't allow any additional batteries if the checks don't pass. So my next step would be to establish some light sources and switches that the player will be able to flick on and off to maybe ease up the usage of power in these locations. If anything, the flexibility was just interesting to program, and because there's really not a whole lot happening in the game besides just the survival, it's probably going to be worthwhile not to piss the player off that they can't use their abundance of small batteries to power something large. So this is all the progress that I've been able to put together in the last week. There's been a lot of consideration, a lot of contemplation on my process of how I go about these games, because I mean, should I be applying the same strategy to all these games? Because I seem to have a pretty good time building this project with the way I do, kind of addressing one item at a time. There's really not a whole lot happening here anyways, and it's not a massive project, so maybe for something small, something like this, it makes more than enough sense. Of course, I don't know. I would really have to come to the conclusion after I publish this project, if it actually comes to that. So fingers crossed, let's not lose vision of what we're doing this for. And yeah, I think we've done some pretty good work this week. So, if you guys found this interesting, drop a like. If you want to support this channel, you could sign up to the Patreon, but I would highly recommend to instead sign up to my own website, theconceptbait.net, where instead of good vibes for helping out, you're actually going to get all the video content you see me work in these update videos. From start to finish, every project you've seen me work, you'll find the video when I create the project, design all the assets, do all the animations, program all the features, and eventually publish all the games. I think it's going to be a much more worthwhile contribution than just Patreon. So visit the page, see if you like anything, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.